Yesterday, I asked you, if you didn't have a penis, how would you penetrate a female? Here are the animal kingdom's best answers. Now, you may be asking, Zinniop, what is your obsession with animal junk? First of all, you can't use the word obsession like that. I have OCD. And secondly, they vary a lot between species, and not a lot of other people talk about them because they're a weird subject. So, let's embrace the weird. The male reproductive system is pretty similar across all animals, in the sense that if you generalize anything enough, it becomes broadly applicable. By that I mean two gonads that make sperm, a tube to a space, and then a tube to an outside. In mammals, the space provides a framework for the prostate, and in most other animals, it provides some sort of analogous structure that mixes fluid in with the sperm. I don't have time to get into the entire male anatomy because it will absolutely not be applicable to other species. What we're interested in today is what happens at the end of the tube. Why is it useful to have something here? Well, the most basic ending is just a gonopore. It ends in a hole with no fanfare. In species like spiders, it's separate, and in some birds, it ends in the cloacal area by merging with the urethra. Arguably, the same is true of mammals. But more importantly, no. Some birds reproduce through something called a cloacal kiss. You press openings together, fluids ooze from one bird to another, and then you're done. The whole thing barely takes a few seconds. I'm sorry if my descriptions are gross, but cloacas are gross! Let's move on to a standard penis. This developed in mammals separately from reptiles and birds. The mammalian penis is derived from tail tissue, while the reptilian is derived from leg tissue. Now, the archetypal mammalian penis might be a bit different from what you expect. It's covered in something called a prepuce, a loose wrap of connective tissue. It may also not be surprising to know that the penis is supposed to be covered by a flap of skin, but I wouldn't know anything about that. Anyway, and probably more importantly, there's a bone called the baculum. Now, you may be thinking, obviously, why else is it called a boner? I'm just going to ignore that. Now, the baculum is weird because it's not connected to the rest of the skeleton, it's just freely floating around in the penis. A lot of the differences between human and other mammals' reproductive anatomy can be chalked up to the result of us being monogamous and able to mate whenever we want. For example, one of the main purposes of the baculum, any spines emerging from the penis, and erectile tissue in general, is to prolong the act of intromission, which is the general logic that the more time you spend in a female, the less time anyone else can. Now, this sounds like terrible logic to us, with us being able to mate all the time except for a few days out of every month, but most other animals are limited to estrus, which only occurs a few days out of every month, within the already limited mating season. Also, having more bells and whistles attached to the penis means you can drag out another male's semen, which is solved by humans' general monogamy. Additionally, in some cases, if you poke a female's insides enough, she'll ovulate. This is again covered by the hominid menstrual cycle. Over to marsupials, the main change is that the bone is gone. I suppose that's not the main change. The main change is that there are two heads. Also, the testicles are in front of the penis, and this is the same hole they use for the digestive tract, so it's a cloaca. Now, this is the marsupial default, and it's modified into separate holes with an excretory or urogenital, or all of them are separated. Whichever one the genital tube is attached to ends in a penis. Monotremes, on the other hand, have only one hole, hence the name. Echidnas famously have a four-headed penis, while platypi only have two, and that's mammals. Also, female hyenas have a pseudopenis. This is technically just a very large clitoris. That's actually how you can tell the difference, because male hyenas have a notable coronal sulcus, while females just have a glans all the way down. Over to sauropsids. We have lizards and snakes with two separate penises. Like monotreme penises, these can be inverted back up into the cloaca, something like how you can poke in the fingers of an inflated glove and they go back out if you squeeze it. The ancestral form is believed to be a single penis, which makes sense compared to the unpaired single vagina of a female. It also matches the less derived archosaurs. Some alligators are said to be permanently erect, though in practice this means very little because it essentially just means they have hard tissue there, which you may note is also true of all mammals with a baculum. Most birds do not have a penis. They have a gene that deletes the penis in late development. The few birds with a penis, ratites, tinamous, and waterfowl, still have that gene, but it's deactivated. Why? Well, why does anything happen evolutionarily? Okay, we just don't know. Flying is very hard, sometimes you just have to shed things, but most waterfowl still fly, a lot. So that brings me to the reasons I hinted at previously. For the cloacal kiss, the female has to cooperate. Because I'm still worried I might be able to monetize this video, let's talk about rape. The term sexual coercion is used for non-human animals, and like a lot of mating evolutions, it results in some very counterintuitive selective pressures. For males, it's pretty straightforwardly beneficial. You mate with a female, And that's pretty much the end of the story for you. Females usually need to put in more energy to produce offspring. This is kind of the definition of being female. With that in mind, they need to be sexually selective and only want to mate with the best male. Even so, there is still the point that no matter how bad it is for you, mating in general is still evolutionarily selected for. But there are further negatives. Sexual coercion is unpleasant for the female and causes stress, and negative mental health affects a negative physical health. Also, if you have evolved some sort of defense, they have to damage it, part of you, to get through. That makes sexual coercion straightforwardly negative for them. Anyway, this produces an arms race where males develop a longer penis and the females develop a longer vagina, usually in a spiral because spirals are easy to make. We see this in ducks, bottlenose dolphins, and H. sisyphus. But we don't know why all the other birds don't do that. Though I consider the fact that owls don't have penises and swans do to be some sort of world building. Anyway, next up is amphibians. Now, amphibians don't really enter into the conversation because they spawn instead of mating, so there's no need for fluid to transfer from one animal to another. But there is something called Amplexus, where the male mounts the female, so he's right there to fertilize them as they come out. This is widely believed to be a precursor to internal fertilization. There is also at least one frog, the aptly named tailed frog, with a penis. At this point, there's not too much interesting to say about individual penises because they're just diverted cloacas. Cloacae, maybe. There's also some newts where the male ejaculates into a packet, which the female then siphons up. Strangely, this will be similar to what spiders do. Even more strangely, these newts also use sexual coercion, basically via pheromones. Over to fish. First off, most fish no longer have a cloacal, they split it all up. By default, fish spawn and don't have amplexus, but a few, primarily guppies, have a gonopodium, which is derived from the anal fin. This is a sort of funnel that's just up next to the gonopore. These fish also use sexual coercion, and the gonopodium is covered in spikes for all the typical reasons a penis might be covered in spikes. Next up, sharks have two claspers derived from parts of the pelvic fin. You might point out that this makes them homologous to Reptile Hemipenes, but it really doesn't. Not any more than this part of your leg is the same as this part. There's not too much complicated going on here. Again, it's just kind of a groove. They get simpler the further back we go. More accurately, the larger the clades are, the more I have to generalize to remain accurate. Lampreys don't have internal fertilization. Their cloacas can avert a little bit to shoot them in the right direction, but that doesn't really mean anything. Starfish don't even have that, and neither do any other animals. That just leaves the protostomes, which is basically just arthropods and mollusks. Arthropods are amazingly diverse, and I already made a video about spiders. Basically, they have a gonopore, ejaculate into some webs, and then they slurp the sperm up into their pedipalps, which are modified arms, and then they use those for fertilization. Decapods have similar gonopods, also derived from modified arms, but not homologously, and they can't slurp, so they just kind of hold it. Sessile crustaceans like the barnacle need longer and more mobile genitals, which is believed to be unrelated to the gonopods of other crustaceans, though we're not really sure. Most of the research surrounding these has been about how aquadynamics affects the dimensions of the penis. Insects are very diverse. The base form is called an Aedeagus, and females also have an extension called the ovipositor, which is used to deposit eggs carefully, hence the name. Insects also have additional sexual parts that pry open the female ovipositor, or maybe just praying mantises do that. To be honest, I don't really know because the source I had for that topic was really distracting. Anyway, over to specific clades, the silverfish doesn't actually penetrate at all. The male deposits his sperm into a spermatophore, which the female then inserts. Caddisflies, mayflies, and some earwigs have two Aedeagoi, which are used for the two female openings. Dragonflies also use a spermatophore, but they just put it on another part of their body, so they still have to penetrate, but they do it in a wheel position, holding the female in place with their claspers. A lot of other groups also use claspers, but they don't have a second mating area. Grasshoppers produce a spermatophylax in addition to their mating packet, which is a gift of sorts that the female eats, providing her nutrients and also distracting her from mating with other males. There are a couple of species of flies where the male lacks an Aedeagus, and the female gynoso penetrates the male to collect the sperm. Male bees have an internal Aedeagus called an endophallus. Mating for bees is much more high stakes because of the male-female asymmetry, so going back to the glove metaphor, male bees can essentially pop it. Beetles can often have spikes for all the typical reasons, but also just for the heck of poking a woman. This, of course, leads to homosexual behavior being observed. And finally, the octopus. Octopi have a modified arm called a Hectocotylus. Unlike all the other species using a modified arm, it doesn't first release the sperm onto a hand. No, the sperm tubes run through the Hectocotylus, which is then inserted into the female's siphon, and he sprays his sperm inside her head, and she takes it from there. Wow, I'm knackered, lad. Make sure to subscribe if you want me to come to your home and shove my hand in your mouth for several hours.